Good morning, everyone. You're very welcome to this first session of the conference. My name is Patrick Malone, and I'm a researcher at the UCD Geary Institute. We have four very interesting presentations for you this morning for this session titled The Just Transition. Starting us off this morning is Ms. Sinéad Mercier. Sinéad is a consultant in climate change law and policy with a special focus on just transition and human rights approaches. She is currently working with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and has previously worked for the National Economic and Social Council, the Green Party of Ireland, and Philip Lee Law Firm. The title of Sinéad's presentation this morning is Four Cases for Just Transition, Lessons for Ireland. So Sinéad, if you'd like to start your presentation there.
Great, so thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm going to be covering, four cases of just transition, and also just a brief overview of what the phrase just transition itself might mean. So firstly, just this photo here in front of us. So this is a photo of the president of the Maldives. So the Maldives is a small island developing nation that will be underwater if we don't keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We've already reached 1.1. So I'd like to highlight this photograph and the kind of plight of these kind of developing countries that have no part in creating climate change that will be worst affected by it. Just transition can sometimes tend to be very Western focused, and just to kind of highlight that situation. So firstly, so I was contracted by the National Economic and Social Council to explore four case studies of best practice on just transition in different countries. So I looked at Germany, I looked at the Ruhr Valley in West Germany, and I also looked at Laos and the Coal Exit Commission in East Germany. And I also looked at the Latrobe Valley, which is kind of a much smaller example, maybe around 850 job losses, so very similar to the Midlands. And I also looked at Scotland, which is an interesting example of a whole economy approach to transitioning away from fossil fuels. Scotland is interesting because it's very focused on renewable energy, so very large offshore wind industry, onshore wind, but also a significant oil and gas industry because of the North Sea as well. So under the Climate Action Plan, Richard Bruton tasked the National Economic and Social Council to look at how Ireland would be affected by the transition due to digital technology and also low carbon industries as well. So that was what the report was done on, and the report actually received a presidential endorsement by Michael D. Higgins, which was very rare, and the report is called Addressing Employment Vulnerability as Part of the Just Transition in Ireland, and it lays out kind of the definition of just transition, how Ireland can engage in this approach and kind of benefit everybody in sort of a Green New Deal sort of fashion. So I would very much recommend reading it. It's also very important because under the European Green New Deal, which is Ursula von der Leyen approach to climate action, we're now seeing a shift away from a very kind of flexible market mechanisms type of climate law. So climate law tends to be very much focused on market-based approaches due to the Kyoto Protocol and the emissions trading scheme. But we're now seeing a shift where transitions now are required to be in line with the European Pillar of Social Rights and a kind of more human rights based focus. So underpinned by a just transition where no one is left behind. And the governance regulation, which is the European law under which Ireland must cut its emissions, must also develop, Ireland must develop a national energy and climate plan, which will cut these emissions, but it also must develop a territorial just transition plan. So I believe that Ireland has already sent out a tender for this. So I would advise, as trade unionists and others interested in this area, to kind of look at how that can be done, what guidelines can be done for Ireland, and what approach can be taken. So what are the origins of just transition? So it's kind of the phrase is becoming, being used for a wide range of issues, but as we know it today, and the reason why it's become so popular is because of the Paris Agreement in 2015. So in 2015, 192 countries from around the world came together to agree to cut emissions so that we can keep below 2 degrees or hopefully 1.5 degrees warming. And in doing so, all countries must ensure that those emissions cuts do not harm decent work or quality jobs. that we look after workers and that we look after human rights in the cutting of those emissions. And this was very important because it's actually the first international environmental treaty that refers not only to human rights, but to decent work and quality jobs. So even though this requirement was actually in an article on its own, it was relegated to the preamble along with human rights and climate justice, but it is still very important that it is there and that we have an international guideline approach developed by the ILO as well. However, the phrase is actually older again. It started in the 1990s from Tony Mazzocchi, who noticed that while he wanted to be part of the Ban the Bomb movement and part of the peace movement globally as a trade unionist, he also wanted to ensure that those who worked in nuclear energy or in chemicals didn't get left behind as new environmental regulations got brought in. And this led to kind of a Green New Deal approach where you look after workers and their communities, which again comes back to a long history of environmentalists, scientists, health and safety experts working with trade unions to get rid of black lung disease or other issues. But again, just transition is actually still older and comes from this idea, particularly from developing countries who were very resource dependent, so dependent on exporting their fossil fuels to other countries. They saw energy as a right and a public good and not a commodity for wealthy countries to extract from them. And the president of Mexico, just after the oil crisis, when Mexico started falling into major debt and having to do structural adjustment under the IMF, he proposed in 1979 a just transition from one age of man's history to the next. So taking this idea that we develop a world energy plan, that we move away from nuclear energy and fossil fuels into wind and solar renewables, and that's benefiting to all. And this again is something that trade unions at a European level are very much campaigning on. The European Public Services Union are working with environmentalists and a lot of kind of social justice organisations such as the Vincent de Paul to defend the right to freedom from energy poverty. So good quality housing, good quality clean energy as a right. And this is also in Ireland as well. So this kind of like wariness around perhaps the carbon tax, wariness around increasing energy prices on an individualistic level, rather than perhaps a kind of whole economy approach. So as one example, travellers, 77% of travellers in halting sites are in severe energy poverty. And this is kind of an issue that's just going to grow. Now that's a wider perspective of just transition, but still important. So just to go to the examples. So I took the Ruhr Valley in Western Germany.
You have 2 minutes, Sinead.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yep, thanks.
So the Ruhr Valley in Western Germany is an example of a country that has transitioned quite well from fossil fuels. They've transitioned from heavily reliant on coal and steel into a more renewable and high economy approach. And what I would recommend here is that unfortunately the transition did take 60 years, but the government itself rolled up the sleeves and got heavily involved in a series of coal roundtables with trade unionists, with environment, with local government and with the coal companies to ensure that there was very high paying conditions in new industries, to ensure that people weren't left behind in the region, that there was going to be skill upgrading, high quality kind of redundancy payments. Now it was a difficult transition, but they did shut down the last coal mines in 2018 without much kind of social unrest. And it was done by creating high quality jobs in the region. The area understood that they were built on high quality jobs after years of trade union organising. If they tried to focus on foreign direct investment, attracting that into the region, they would end up with call centres similar to what happened in England with the closure of coal mines in Wales. So they focus on skills audits, finding out what are our local skills base, what are we good at, and then very proactive, consistent engagement by government consistently using social dialogue to develop new industries and alternative infrastructure. And that was then backed by huge funds by government. So a very expensive transition, but it did work out quite well. And there was also a lot of respect there for the communities and for how they had built the region. So this photo here was kind of part of a campaign, December 2018, with the closures, thanking miners for keeping the lights on. at night. So that kind of respect for local people is very important. And Germany now is undertaking a much faster transition, again using this very strong kind of social dialogue approach, all people at the table, trade unions and coal companies and government rolling up the sleeves and working together to hash out alternatives, and then backed by a 40 billion package. So this is the phase out of brown coal, so it's a softer coal, and also coal use in all power plants is going to be phased out by 2035, 2038, not in line with the Paris Agreement, but still very positive that they managed to get that. And it's a good example of a very kind of rural region, again, having to phase out very quickly, but with that kind of very strong support. And as a signifier of trust, the government, and once the Coal Exit Commission published its report in 2018, the government immediately passed a bill with this 40 billion package for skills, investment, retirement, and alternatives in the region. So again, that level of trust must be there. So just as a quick example, the Latrobe Valley in Australia is kind of an example of a much smaller scale issue. Around 850 jobs are being lost because the closure of a coal mine and power plant station, Hazelwood Power Plant. Now, the interesting thing about this, I think, in terms of a lesson for Ireland, it's an example of where environmentalists and trade unionists and local government didn't really work well together. So this photo here in the top right-hand corner is an example of kind of the environmental organisations very much kind of in a difficult time showed that Hazelwood was kind of an example of the most polluting coal station in Australia. It was very embarrassing for Australia, without maybe acknowledging the context of what happened in that region. So in the 1980s, there was a 90% drop in employment due to privatization of the energy system. And this created mass unemployment and very kind of
I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Sinead. Unfortunately, time has caught up on us.
Okay, that's okay.
I have a question from the attendees. You mentioned the word tender being issued for the National Just Transition Plan, and the attendee was wondering, could you perhaps clarify this? And the PFG treated the Just Transition Plan as a policy framework, so why a tender?
As in, well, a tender goes out to different kind of businesses or different groups who then propose to government a kind of plan that could be developed for the region. So it's kind of, it's like a standard thing that government will get this kind of expertise from other companies or other other organizations.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Sinead. Just to remind the attendees, we have a Q&A box there below if you'd like to just submit your questions. Thank you, Sinead, for that interesting presentation, and sorry for the time there. So the next presenter is Miss Adrienne Buller, and Adrienne is a senior research fellow at the Commonwealth think tank, where she leads the Green New Deal programme. Elsewhere, her work has focused on the relationship between the financial system and the climate emergency. The title of Adrienne's presentation this morning is The Democratic Economy and a Green New Deal. So if you'd like to start your presentation there, Adrienne.
Sure, just a second. Let me just get it into full screen. There we go. Is that visible for everybody? Great. So the focus today for me will be on the Green New Deal as a policy program for achieving a just transition, which Sinead explained very effectively. So the Green New Deal is sort of an idea that has captured minds on both sides of the Atlantic and sort of is a bit of a popular slogan now. But I just wanted to delineate what it means to Commonwealth, which is the think tank where I work. And it's a program that aims to make the just transition not just for workers in affected industries, although it's very important, but also for society more broadly. So in the process of decarbonization, aiming to not reproduce the sort of economic ills that currently define our system insofar as steep inequalities in wealth and economic power. Looking at the institutions that currently hold back sort of radical progress on climate change, so finance capital and large corporates, and re-envisioning how these could be transformed to not only unblock progress, but also to create a new sort of economic consensus that is sustainable for the long term, rather than simply greening systems and problems that we currently have in place. This is what makes the Green New Deal more than just green. It draws its inspiration from the New Deal, which responded to Wall Street crash, resulting Great Depression, as well as the coincidence of an ecological crisis in the Dust Bowl in the 30s. And I just give this very brief sort of history lesson because I think it's quite helpful to understand sort of the institutional change impetus behind the Green New Deal. So when most people think of the Green New Deal as well as the New Deal itself, the primary idea is that of a massive program of public investment in infrastructure and other public works, which was meant as a process of job creation. And that is very similar in the Green New Deal insofar as we tend to think of massive home retrofitting programs and investment in decarbonizing energy and transport systems. But like the New Deal, that is sort of only one component of what is necessary to achieve a genuinely just transition. And so what the New Deal also did, which is often lesser known, is gradually build a completely different economic consensus than the one that had existed prior. It did this through reining in the power of finance capital, for instance, through the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated investment and retail banking, the suspension of the gold standard. It also implemented the National Industrial Recovery Act, which instituted a number of changes to support workers' rights, as well as to empower labor unions. They brought in Social Security and the invention of sort of the welfare system in the United States, as well as the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act, which sounds very unexciting, but actually had a number of programs intended to support agricultural communities to undertake their own sort of conservation work. So ultimately, and, in addition to just the sort of public stimulus side of things, was a fundamental shift in power and in wealth in the US economy, which subsequently spanned several decades and, made strides toward defining new purposes for the US economy. So productive investment over speculation, a social safety net in place of laissez-faire, and the growth of labor power relative to capital, in addition to sort of improved stewardship of natural resources. And although it had many limitations, which I don't detail today, time constraints, this is sort of what the Green New Deal program that we undertake at Commonwealth aims to replicate. And that is, understanding what the root of the problems are, the shared problems of sort of climate crisis, inequality, and the erosion of labor power, and tackling them at that root. So I'm sure everyone is a bit sick of seeing this graphic, but I think it just gets at the idea of a just transition, which is that this is showing that the sort of richest 10% of the global population is responsible for about half of all lifestyle emissions. This is replicated also within countries in other issues like waste production and resource use, sort of culminating in this review recently in Nature. And ultimately, we have a system in which those least responsible for the climate crisis are set to bear its front, and achieving a just transition means ensuring that that is not the case, and sort of the distribution of both costs and benefits is fairly done. So, in order to do that, what we need to tackle is the system that's creating these inequalities in the first place. So I use this slide about BlackRock, but to show that ultimately we have a system that is dominated by the interests of finance capital, a massive asset management industry, which has been partnered with sort of a decline in worker power relative to both shareholders and to executive power in the firm. So at Commonwealth, we design policies that explicitly aim to tackle these problems. So looking at how we can tackle financialization and reconstitute and redesign the firm, as well as finance and asset management, in order to support a just transition and to tackle sort of the drivers of climate crisis and inequalities at their shared roots. So this is 5 pillars of our Green New Deal program. Obviously, it's quite large and dense. So today I'll just be focusing on one of our focuses, which is a reimagined company form. So this is from a recent report which we produced looking at the largest non-financial UK domiciled companies, and just looking at the trends in sort of hollowing out of the firms, so looking at rises in shareholder payouts relative to profits, as well as, not shown here, declining tax rates at the same time, as well as general declines in capital intensive industries in capital expenditures relative to profits, as well as to depreciation. So we're seeing a hollowing out of firms, which has been detrimental not just to workers, but also has been coupled with sort of the decline of environmental and climate stewardship. And I think this paired with the second graph there, which shows just the sort of massive skew of wealth in the UK. This is showing private pensions as well as stocks and shares, ISAs, shows that we have the dual problem of companies needing to respond increasingly to the imperatives of shareholder value maximization, paired with an increasing concentration of shareholders among a smaller and smaller number of individuals, as well as management among a smaller and smaller number of vast firms. So ultimately, we're seeing a concentration of wealth and economic power that is immensely undemocratic, which results in a shirking of responsibility and is driving massive inequalities, as well as climate and environmental chaos. So as part of our Green New Deal program, we look at an alternative model for the company as one mechanism of supporting a just transition that genuinely produces long-term sustainable change and provides voice for workers in driving that change. So this slide here just shows sort of an overview schematic, but a number of these programs that we've worked on, which I can detail elsewhere or share the reports with, are the creation of what we call employee ownership funds or inclusive ownership funds, in which you slowly capitalize a fund for workers in the company such that they end up with a stake and a say in the management of that company as well as in its returns. And that will give immediately a gradual growth of worker voice relative to just executives and shareholders in the firm, such that they can participate in a just transition. The other is looking at sort of the democratization of the ownership side of the pie there, and looking at solutions that would reduce the immense skew of wealth that we've seen, such that corporates are accountable just to a tiny number of shareholders. And this involves ideas like the capitalization of a social wealth fund, potentially taking advantage of some of the bailouts that we've seen as part of the COVID corporate financing facility in the UK, to take public stakes and capitalize that fund, and demand not only worker retention, which we haven't seen, but also long-term improved conditions for workers, giving them a voice in firm decisions, and attaching decarbonization targets as part of that. All of this in sort of a New Deal style could fall under something like the Green Recovery Act, which we produced with some legal academics at King's, which again looks at a number of sort of legislative interventions, such as from small things like preventing voting in shareholder resolutions without the express consent of those represented, to a full employment, income and training guarantee as part of a just transition, and additional duties on corporate executives and shareholders for meeting decarbonization targets. So that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of what we foresee a just transition necessarily entailing, and how a Green New Deal, drawing from the inspiration of sort of institutional architectural reform in the New Deal era, can draw on that legacy to build legislatively a just transition going forward. Thanks. Hopefully that was on time.
Thank you very much for that, Adrienne. That was a very, very interesting presentation. One question that was posed from an attendee is that they couldn't see if Ireland was included in the chart on global income deciles and associated lifestyle consumption. Was it? And what share is associated with the top 10% in Ireland?
So the chart that I showed was just an amalgamation of all countries globally. I don't actually know Ireland's specific share, but I do know that within European countries more broadly, including the UK, Ireland, and France, within country distributions tend to be that the top 10% of the population consumes about 50 times more carbon emissions than the bottom half as well. So these relationships tend to hold specifically within countries as well, although I don't unfortunately have the Irish figures off the top of my head.
No problem. It's interesting to see as well that your discussion about environmental stewardship and that diagram about the company. Would you like to provide some more detail around that and how that operates?
Yeah, so currently the problem that we see with corporate stewardship is that incentives aren't aligned to actually steward the environment and climate. And in part, that's because you're accountable to a tiny number of extremely powerful shareholders. So the big three asset management firms, for example, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, typically own between 3 and 7% of most major corporates in the United States, as well as increasingly in Europe. And they're on track to collectively hold close to half of that by 2040, according to academic studies, which is a problem insofar as they care very little about the individual environmental performance of the companies that they hold. So we see a need to break up that sort of concentration and monopolization of power in order to advocate stewardship. So partly that's sort of a public social wealth fund with perhaps a mission to decarbonize. And it's also partly giving workers at that company a stake in it so that they have a voice in voting as well as can express their expertise in driving that transition.
That's very good. Thank you very, very much for that presentation, Adrienne. Just to let everyone know that we have a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen there if you'd like to put some questions to our presenters. Next up, we have Dr. Aoife Lochlainn from the Nevin Economic Research Institute. Aoife has an interest in environmental, economic and social policy in her research. The title of Aoife's presentation this morning is Planning for a Just Transition in Northern Ireland. So Aoife, if you'd like to share your screen there and you can start your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Patrick, and thanks to the two previous speakers for their very interesting papers. There we go. So I'm going to talk today about planning for a just transition in Northern Ireland. We heard earlier from Sinead about a number of different approaches for just transition. There are, many different descriptions of what constitutes a just transition, but at their heart, there's always a focus on ensuring that the transition to a low carbon economy supports decent livelihoods and working conditions for workers and their communities. I'm on the wrong slide, sorry. So there we go. The ILO guidelines, as you can see them there, they spell out common principles that you'll find across different just transition approaches, social dialogue, rights at work, bespoke policies, etc. And we'll actually come back to that towards the end of the presentation. So we'll start by looking at Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland's emissions profile and its current targets. So it currently accounts for approximately 4% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, even though it makes up just 3% of the population. In the past year, under the 2008 Climate Change Act, the UK introduced a new target, which is a net zero emissions by 2050. And Scotland followed this up with their announcement, which is a net zero target by 2045. And Wales is going to reduce their emissions by 95% by 2050. So this leaves Northern Ireland sort of out on its own, the only devolved nation which has no climate targets of its own at the moment. However, since the establishment or the re-establishment of this government, the all-party agreement, New Decade, New Approach, commits to a climate change act with legally binding and ambitious sectoral emissions reduction targets. And there you can see there in the chart on the left, the latest projections from DERA, which is the Department for Agriculture and Environment in Northern Ireland. So the current target, I guess, is for Northern Ireland goes back to 2011, and that's a target of 35% reduction by 2025. And up until 2019, it was actually projected to miss this target by about 3%, but due to an announced closure of the Kilroot coal-powered electricity station, and then the subsequent announcement that that will actually be converted to a gas-powered station, the Department of Agriculture and Environment has now projected that the 35% target will actually be exceeded in 2025. And you can see that there in the projections in the chart for 2025 and 2030. The largest reductions in emissions you can see is actually from energy supply, and this is followed by some reductions in business and waste management. So what of the actual emissions profile of Northern Ireland? Well, you can see here that it actually has an emissions profile which is more similar to the Republic of Ireland than other UK companies. In particular, its agricultural emissions around 27%, which means that it's nearly 3 times larger than the rest of the UK, which is around 10% on average. It has the lowest energy supply emissions of the 4 countries, which is also unsurprising given the historical and current importance of the coal and oil industries in Britain. But given the likelihood of climate change legislation being enacted in the near future, and also the political and civil society and business pressure on the government at the moment to introduce binding targets and also a commitment to just transition, what would a just transition look like? Well, going back to the ILO guidelines, one of the main principles is that the policies and programs are tailored to the needs of every country and region. So the first question we might like to ask is, what are the jobs or sectors that might be vulnerable to job losses or displacement? The first group of workers to find themselves impacted by decarbonisation are often those in the energy generation and fossil fuel extraction sectors. But that depends very much on the emissions profile of the country or the region. And it might not actually be obvious which sectors will be impacted. So the first task, therefore, is to identify the possible vulnerable sectors and risks. Turning to Northern Ireland, which sectors are most at risk? Well, to answer that, we need to identify which sectors have high emissions, how many jobs there are in those sectors, and what the emissions data per person employed are. So for this, we need to have emissions data per sector, preferably also at subsector level. However, the emissions per sector data is only available for the UK as a whole, and you can see an example there on the left. You don't have to read it. But this data is, unfortunately, it's not available for Northern Ireland. You can't actually get employment by sector, or you can get, sorry, employment by sector, but you can't get the similar data for emissions. Northern Ireland emissions data is published in line with the IPCC sources. Therefore, it's not actually possible to calculate the emissions per persons employed as you can for the UK as a whole. So with this data gap in mind, how can we identify which sectors and workers are vulnerable in a transition to a low carbon economy? Well, the inventory categories, they do give us some information. It's clear that the agricultural sector, for example, has a tough road ahead of it to decrease emissions. While the carbon intensity of the sector has increased since 1990, the overall emissions have remained static. And this is due to increased output, which is evidenced very much in the dairy sector, where gains in reducing emissions per unit of production, it's 31% since 1990, were matched by a growth in total milk production, or that was an increase in yield per cow, so it wiped it out. However, it's much more difficult to identify sectors and subsectors within the business and industry categories. So one way we might think about examining the issue is maybe to look at high emissions companies who are part of the European Emissions Trading Scheme, as just as an indicator of which power plants, which stations and industrial plants emit GHG emissions on a large scale. So there's a map here. The list of companies that I have mapped out here, you can find them on the European Commission's Union Registry. So if we map those installations, we can see that it includes a number of power stations, most of the power stations, but it also includes a number of manufacturing plants. There are 4 dairy, 1 meat, and 5 other manufacturing plants, which include glass and aerospace manufacturing. If we also want to get a look at the employment data for the same areas, we can get an indication of how dependent each area is on certain sectors for employment. So I'm not suggesting you read this tiny little screen here, but I'll just draw your attention maybe to Mid-Ulster there in the left bottom corner. You can see there that it has a 30% employment in manufacturing. and one manufacturing plant which participates in the scheme. That particular manufacturing plant has over 2,000 employees, which is higher than any of the power plants. So a benefit to mapping these installations and looking at employment by sector on a geographic basis is that we can identify these communities which might be negatively impacted due to plant closures or rationalizations in the future. So while we might use other data sources such as the EU ETS register, it isn't really a good substitute for the provision of data on emissions per economic sector. So without that data, identifying policies for a just transition is actually very difficult. We might also ask ourselves, though, what jobs will a low carbon economy have? Green jobs has many definitions, but in general, they must benefit the environment, but also be produced using environmentally friendly processes. The environmental goods and services are analogous to green goods or green jobs, and there are 17 categories of that, from renewable energy to environment education. But again, this isn't available at Northern Ireland level. There is a subsection available, which is the low carbon renewable energy sectors, such as renewable energy and energy efficiency products. And you can see there Northern Ireland and other UK countries and how they fared, how the different groups in the different countries, the percentage change. So what's interesting is that the level of sort of low carbon employment in Northern Ireland displayed in the chart is that it decreased nearly 20% since 2014, and this is due to a decrease in the energy efficient product category. Low carbon heat and energy from waste has increased. The largest share in this employment is in onshore wind, and I guess what this really tells us is that there's no sort of big jobs out there waiting for people to take up, that actually the job level in the low carbon economy is it's quite static, and it's quite low compared to the other sectors. So I know I'm running out of time, so I will be very, very brief talking about the skills that you might need for a low carbon economy. And according to research by the IPPR, skills in the low carbon economy require long periods of study and skill levels of, I'd say, equal to the Leaving Cert or the AS level upwards. Most of the roles in the low carbon economy are also of a very technical nature. So if we look there, we can see the proportion of students who are studying STEM in higher level institutions in Northern Ireland, and 50% of those in their first degree are studying STEM subjects, and that falls to 40% at a postgraduate level. So that's actually pretty good. But then if we look at the percentage of workers and the level of qualifications they hold, we see that actually only 36% of workers have level Q4, which would be a certificate level or higher. 16% only have, they only have the equivalent of a Leaving Cert or AS level, and 8.6% of economically active workers actually had no qualification. And this is the highest percentage in all of the regions in the UK. So there's a considerable room for improvement in the skills base in Northern Ireland. So a just transition, a planned just transition would ensure that skills training was available for those who lost employment and did not have the skills to take up alternative employment in the low carbon economy. Indeed, part of planning for the just transition must be an assessment of whether the skills system is actually adequate for the transition to the low carbon economy. So that brings us all the way back again to the ILO guidelines. For the transition to the low carbon economy to be successful, it must be just. But a just transition doesn't happen by accident. It requires significant action by the state, from consulting with workers and communities, as we heard earlier, to directly supporting those displaced, to ensuring that the skill system is fit for purpose. As per the guidelines, the ILO guidelines, there must be coherent and bespoke programs. for there to be specific programs for specific places, the Northern Ireland government needs relevant data so that we know which sectors, workers and areas are most at risk from possible negative impacts of the transition. Government also needs climate policy framework with legally binding targets and sectoral plans, and the commitment in the New Decade, New Approach should be prioritised. Given the scale of the challenge in Northern Ireland, of course, social dialogue should be built into any framework or policy, and I shall leave it there.
Thank you very much, Aoife, for that very interesting presentation. We have two questions here from the audience. You mentioned that we don't have Northern Ireland specific data for emissions by sector. And this attendee was wondering, might we expect emissions by sector to be different in Northern Ireland from what is in the UK?
I think we would. We know from looking at the IPCC categories that Northern Ireland has a different emissions. I'll actually, if I go back up, you can see it. It has a different emissions profile, and you can see that agriculture takes up a huge amount of Northern Ireland's emissions profile, whereas in England, Scotland, Wales, it's much, on average, they are 10%. In energy supply, there's obviously more coal and oil in Scotland, England and Wales, and there's a historical resources issue, but reason for that. Other areas where we might see differences are in business and industry, and there's far fewer large manufacturing plants basically in Northern Ireland than you would find in these countries. So if we had the data and we could drill down into it, I think we would find differences. And I think it would actually throw up the issue in the food, agri-food industry. It would actually highlight that a lot better, because you could say, yes, this is from dairy processing. We know this is from dairy processing. We know these emissions are from meat processing, and it would be easier then to put together, to actually come up with coherent policies to challenge that or to tackle that.
Thank you, Aoife. The second question there for you is, what effects, if any, on the Republic of Ireland labour market has a just transition already had? Say since the GFC, how has Ireland employment been impacted?
I'm going to leave the Republic of Ireland to the next presenters, because that's actually the topic of their presentation. So I definitely would not want to preempt that.
No worries. Thank you again, Aoife, for that presentation. Very interesting. So our final presenter this morning is Ciarán Nugent. Ciarán is an economist at the Nevin Economic Research Institute and is based in the Dublin office. He is currently working on a number of projects relating to the just transition and the Irish labour market. His research interests include income distribution, wages, precarious work, the cost of living and intergenerational inequality. The title of Ciarán's presentation this morning is Matching Skills Needs with Skills Reserves, Protecting Workers and Communities for a Just Transition. Thanks, Ciarán.
Okay, thanks, Patrick, and I'd like to thank everybody there who's presented before me. There's been a lot covered there, actually, that is in this paper, Matching Skills Needs with Skills Reserves. Sinead covered a lot in terms of the importance of social dialogue and involving communities. I'd like to start with a scary picture to bring in the urgency of the issue at hand. That's a satellite image of California this week, which they had to draw in the border because it couldn't be seen with the amount of smoke that's coming from forest fires around San Francisco. And that's what San Francisco looked like this week. In January it was Sydney, and last year it was walruses falling off cliffs in Siberia because the ice is all melted. So just skipping on into it as quickly as possible. It's a long paper, so I'm taking sections and I'm going to present them and skip over the parts that Sinead and Aoife in particular have just covered. So in this paper, we tried to have a stab at what would it actually look like to implement a just transition to a low carbon economy in an Irish context, and what are the steps. And Aoife kind of went through a very similar outline in her paper there. So yeah, obviously we want to identify at-risk sectors. Where are they as well? There's obviously a regional component to all of this, and that comes up in the literature a lot. And what's the skills and age profile of those workers in those most at-risk sectors? We try and broadly, we look at age and education and skill level of the workers in those the sectors most likely to have to transition, and whether or not those what's the ease that those workers what ease those workers will have in transition to a new economy, a low carbon economy. So we look at defining green skills. Again, there's the literature. There's a few different definitions of what green jobs are, and we kind of look at that in an Irish context and make some assumptions about what we think the demand for skills will be in the future based on the comparative advantage of Ireland and the needs in Ireland, and again the sectors in Ireland. And that's informed a lot by the Climate Action Report and literature in an Irish context. So, and we also look at current underutilized skills. One of the themes of the paper, and an additional paper that we did alongside it, a long read, is that we are arguing for the state to intervene to actually create demand for skills based on, on the literature and the Irish situation, and where we can, where we can improve. And yeah, okay. So one of the themes as well is this is, as I said, we're having a stab at it. There's data limitations in all of this, and we need more and better data. There is evidence that green jobs have increased. It's still only a tiny amount. There's a Eurostat figure on green employment that has grown in the last few years at a higher rate than the actual employment growth. So that's a good thing, but we're still a laggard. We all know this. We're bottom of the class, not just in an EU context, but in the European context. And we're looking at fines coming down the road of hundreds of millions of euro. And the paper argues to avoid, the front end investment to avoid those fines coming down the road. So we're twice as much per capita as good performers like Sweden, and almost the same with Italy and France, and even we consume way more carbon dioxide per capita than even the UK. So we've been through what a just transition entails, saving, not burdening, in many cases already economically deprived areas. In many cases, the paper goes through bad examples of a transition in Wales and Appalachian coal regions, and we look at as Sinead covered, the case of the Ruhr in Germany, and the case we look at Scotland. Australia pops up, Spain pops up as well for good examples of how to implement a just transition, which entails a proactive policy approach. Clearly, whatever we've been doing hasn't been working, so I think we argue for more ambition in our climate action, to, as I said, to avoid these fines coming down the road. So we identify first the sectors. Again, in terms of data limitations, this is a good example, but these are non-household emissions, which is what we look at in the, in employment. And, construction there is 1%, but, the manufacturing and cement and bricks are in industry there. So obviously there's crossovers here. Again, if we were to manufacture wind turbines, which we don't, unfortunately, but if we were to, those would be counted in industry. So again, there's a lot of crossover there, a lot of complexity there that we could use more data on. So as we see there, almost 90% of all non-household emissions in Ireland come from about 8.6% of jobs. Agriculture, everyone knows, is a big one. Air transport, obviously. Electricity, gas, steam, and air conditioning is also a big one. But this is probably where a lot of the if we're transitioning to wind and solar, etc., it's these jobs that will be doing that in terms of the push for low carbon electricity and energy. So obviously there's a regional dimension to this, and we have the case at the moment of Bordamona in the Midlands, which is particularly, it's behind relative to other regions in Ireland in terms of employment, in terms of income, even in terms of higher unemployment, etc. So we've in our additional paper, we've also we recommended development in different areas which might suit based on the region and on the West Coast as well. So this is an example of the now, excuse me for, this is a hard table to read, but clearly we have, this here says that 18.2% of employment in agriculture in Ireland is in the border region, but only 7.9% of overall employment. So it's going to be likely affected in the transition, or at least if we're reducing, if we're aiming to reduce carbon emissions from agriculture, then that's an area that we should be concerned about. Same as the Midwest here. In Dublin is transportation, and again, agriculture and forestry in Midlands, which is under pressure at the moment, is likely to see significant job loss in Bordamona, good decent jobs there, and the sectors there are going to be there's going to be pressure for them to adapt to new low carbon techniques and agriculture. So that's it. I'm rushing through that, but that's we've, and again, I'd like to underline the theme of the need for more data on this, more data to inform policy going forward in these areas. So how do we prepare? Again, as I said, green jobs, we don't know exactly what way technology is going, so it's hard to define what the skills need in future is going to be. And we're arguing that the state can push demand or create demand in certain areas based on our on Ireland's comparative advantage and need. And we talk about retrofitting and low carbon energy sources. So, but there is consensus at least that we're going to need a lot of STEM workers with STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and also administration and business. And we give evidence then that there's actually a lot of these skills in what's called a potential labour supply in Ireland, which is a wider indicator of unemployment, and the unemployment rate was about 17% in 2018. In Q2 2020, it's up past 20%. And we look at the skills profile of the sectors that are under threat as well. So what we find is that in electricity, gas, steam, and hot water, it's a relatively young workforce, which we assume it's not the best indicator, but we look at the age profile of the sectors and what share of them are over 55. Basically, the literature on employment in terms of reskilling and retraining is more difficult for older workers. So we assume then that as I think it's up to 40%, 50% of farmers or in crop and animal production are over that age, that they're going to have more difficulty in transitioning, say, if there are opportunities for mixed land use in the future, solar paneling, or cleaner methods of production, that it's going to be more difficult for agriculture. Whereas the opposite is the case in electricity, gas, and steam. A younger profile and more workers with third level education and tertiary education as well. So I've been through that a little bit. There's a regional, again, a regional picture here, and the paper also looks at issues around low levels of in-job training in Ireland, higher ed funding, research and development, further education, and we have far fewer apprenticeship levels, far fewer in apprenticeships than we did 10 years ago, which would be beneficial in terms of a state-led retrofit program, which we argue for in our paper as well. In-job training, higher ed funding, etc., are low in comparison to other high-income European countries, which is something that has to be addressed in terms of meeting the requirements to transition to a low-carbon economy. So you see there, as I said,
Ciarán, sorry to interrupt you. We're actually kind of running to time at the end of this session.
Okay.
So unfortunately, we're running over time for questions and answers. I'm just going to reappear here. Okay, so if you can refer everyone to your attendee email, you'll get links for the next session on precarious work. When you enter that, you may see that you're put into a waiting room. That's just because we have a private room for setup with the panelists, so don't worry. If you can't enter the room, maybe refresh the page as things begin. So we'll be setting up from about now. You should begin at 11:10. So we hope to see you there. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Paul. That was very smooth.